so much for coming. This is a really neat opportunity, and I want to thank Leslie Curtis again for sort of mentioning this opportunity and making the connections between Joseph and I. So many of you already know Joseph because he was in fact a John Carroll graduate. So the undergrads in the room, you know, he gives you a model to aspire to. He graduated from John Carroll in 2000. Correct me if I'm wrong about the facts. Your double major in philosophy and history, art history, correct? And so actually, it's really interesting. There's this new push that John Carroll's going to be making in coming years towards interdisciplinary learning, and in some ways, Joseph anticipates that because he really did take those two majors and fuse them in his work, particularly bringing together the concern about aesthetics from the field of art history and putting it in dialogue with philosophy. And so while he's in the philosophy department, he really does do interdisciplinary work. And it's not just those two fields. If you look at his stuff, it just further than that. So I'll just say a couple other things about him, and then I'll let him take it away. But I want to mention that he got his PhD from Boston College in 2007, and that he's an author of a couple books with a third on the way. So he wrote a book about Foucault called Foucault's Philosophy of Art, a Genealogy of Modernity, and also a book entitled Jacques Rancière, An Introduction to Philosophy, Politics, and Aesthetics, which came out in 2011. And that, I don't know, was it complete yet, the anthology of aesthetics, or? It is. It is, okay.
We're doing a second edition as well.
Oh, wow. Oh, okay. So that is out and available from Amazon. Pick that up. But in any case, the title of that work is The Continuum Anthology of Aesthetics. And I think today what we'll hear about is sort of a summation of some of that work. Is that a fair description of it? Or you describe it for yourself, but so I want to say welcome to Joseph. And you take the floor.
Well, good afternoon. Thanks for coming out. I want to say what an honor and a pleasure it is to be at John Carroll University, to be back at John Carroll University, a place that really gave me so much, and by that I mean really introduced me to the joys and the pleasures of the life of the mind. And just, it's been great to be back and walking around campus and thinking about going to the library, but also thinking about the people who were really quite influential on my life. I was thinking about spending late nights reworking papers with Dr. Curtis for what turned out to be my first academic presentation when I was an undergraduate, or meeting at what was then Arabica with Dr. Brenda Workis, and having really intense, lengthy philosophical conversations, and learning that philosophy and study was a way of life, not just something confined to the classroom. And I definitely don't think I would have done the work I've done were it not for the influence of you two. So I wanted to acknowledge that before I speak today. And I also want to thank Dean Hessinger for the invitation and for organizing. It's a great thrill to be here. I hope I have something here that will be of interest to everyone. My work is quite interdisciplinary. And I thought I would say a few words at the outset before I get into the meat of the paper, which tries to explain what I'm doing, because there will be some parts that are quite technical in nature, and I'm not going to shy away from that. I think it's good for us to push through that together. In this essay, I've tried to use some key passages from the novelist Marcel Proust, where artistic spectatorship, where spectating on art is at issue, to speak about what I see as some of the transformations that afflicted the idea of the beautiful within the modern Western world. That is to say, I see beauty itself as undergoing a transformation at the onset of what is typically known as modernity. And for various reasons I won't get into here, I think modernity and postmodernity are unhelpful markers or names for designating some of these processes, and I would propose other terminological changes, but I won't get into that. Just to say, like, if you're looking for a reference point, the end of the 18th, start of the 19th century is the period I'm interested in, and what happens to the beautiful. And the way in which the beautiful, this concept, is capable of sustaining a number of different forms of experience, but also practical aspirations. The way in which beauty is something that people will assign different meanings to, different significance to, and different aspirations or hopes to. So my work in aesthetics, and in the book I'm writing now, is really intended to point to instances of heterogeneity or transformation within the Western artistic and philosophical experience of the beautiful. And the idea there is that even though we're using the same word, beauty, it doesn't necessarily designate the same experience. And I don't think philosophical thought has been sensitive enough to these transformations. And so what I've tried to do is compose a little allegory of some of these transformations that take place in the experience of the beautiful using Proust. So the last thing I'll say is that I use Proust and Kant to isolate what I would say is a paradoxical structure within the experience of the beautiful. And that structure, to put it simply, is that beauty induces a moment of loneliness, isolation, or separation. All of these are relatively synonymous for me. A type of break or disassociation, an active disassociation from the world of shared meaning and shared sense, at the same time as it holds out the hope that we will in some way rejoin or share those sensations or sentiments with others as an instance of shared pleasure. And so I'm interested in the constant oscillation and constant flipping back and forth that takes place within the experience of the beautiful. I'll be talking about two key passages in Proust, and I've prepared them on this handout for you. So I'll just pass that out now before I get into it. I'll tell you when I get to this handout. So my concern in this talk, which is called On the Sharability of Aesthetic Pleasure, will be, from Kant to Proust, will be just that. To what extent the pleasures associated with the beautiful, the pleasures associated with viewing art, are shareable or not. And in what way are they shareable, and in what ways are they not shareable. And I've placed my contribution under a quotation from, a quotation that's attributed to Gorgias, the Greek sophist, as reported by Sextus Empiricus. And Gorgias is purported to have said, and this may tell you where I'm going to come down a little bit on the question of the shareability and unshareability of aesthetic pleasure. Gorgias is purported to have said, even if something can be known, knowledge about it cannot be communicated to others. A word about methodology in approaching Proust, which is an immense undertaking in and of itself. My purpose in this essay is not to attempt yet another exegesis, systemization, and defense of the supposed philosophical wisdom on display in Marcel Proust's À la recherche du temps perdu, so In Remembrance of Lost Time. And I will just refer to that novel, or that 7-volume novel, as À la recherche throughout this paper. So that's what I'm referring to. For many reasons, including the ironic distance between Proust, the writer, and Marcel, the fictional narrator of À la recherche, any attributions of the book's many theoretical propositions to the historical Proust would be problematic at best. And so one of the difficulties in talking about this book is that it's narrated in the first person by a fictional narrator named Marcel. And in order to try to introduce some clarity as to who I'm referring to, I will refer to Proust as the historical writer and Marcel as the fictional character within À la recherche. So that's a distinction I'm making right here. As readers of À la recherche will likely note, the narrator's own position evolve throughout the work's 7 volumes, thus rendering it difficult to say with certainty what are his definitive thoughts on society, social climbing, friendship, love, and art, and the meaning of life more generally. In this regard, the work certainly does allow readers to pick and choose, and thus to ignore and neglect their maxims at will. However, readers eager to convert the prose of à la recherche into the currency of philosophical speculation ought to pause when expounding yet another theory of art. The narrator drops this, and here I'm quoting from à la recherche: "A work in which there are theories is like an object which still has its price tag on it." So Marcel offers this after expounding many, many theories of art, which people tend to take out of context and then say, this is what Proust thought about art. And what I'm pointing to is the difficulty of saying definitively what a fictional work has to say about a work of art, or works of art in general. The cumulative effect of this and other similar statements is to cast doubt upon the viability of reconstructing Proust's or even Marcel's theory of literature by cobbling together the book's different and many instances incompatible statements on art. A price tag left on an object may be tacky, but at least it has the merit of cueing us into an object's worth. And I'm suggesting there are few such price tags left in that book. The point then is not to determine which philosophical positions we may assign to Proust. The idea is to follow some of the lessons staged in à la recherche as one would any other work of art. I want to use that work to reflect upon the nature and destiny of some of the concepts from the golden age of German aesthetics. It was during this time that many of our current expectations regarding art and literature were forged. The advent of aesthetics codified the social and cultural position that art and literature occupy within Western societies to this day, and aestheticians defined the limits of our experience, creating for us the very idea of what we are capable of experiencing in art. While I don't think that one can easily ascribe any one philosophical position to Proust on the basis of à la recherche, I do think that one can and should use that text to probe some of the ideas that are likely to have occasioned its genesis, and to problematize the framework in which it is likely to be received. To put it simply, this essay, my essay, is about what a certain reading of à la recherche can teach us about the nature of aesthetics, and in particular, one oscillation that I see taking place within the experience of the beautiful. For reasons that I have alluded to, I doubt the viability of offering a comprehensive reading of à la recherche. The narrator himself remarks upon how his works will eventually be received, foregrounding the way in which readers' investments not only color their readings, but actually determine what, in a book of this length, will be construed as text. So what I'm saying is, in a book that's about 3,000 pages long, we're constantly making choices as to what constitutes text and what we're going to ignore, what contradicts whatever reading we might make of it. One such tendency, the narrator notes, is for readers to filter an author's words through their own experiences. For example, Marcel laments that his readers will never truly know Albertine, the love of his life who occupies some of the novel's most moving and interesting pages. At best, he supposes that his book will allow readers to experience Albertine in terms of the women in their own lives, and thus occasion a type of introspection. A frequently cited passage explains that, quote, "In reality, every reader is, while he is reading, the reader of his own self. The writer's work is merely a kind of optical instrument which he offers to the reader to enable him to discern what, without this book, he would perhaps never have perceived in himself." This process, however, is hardly transparent or straightforward. More often than not, we put off encountering the truth in order to see what we want to see. Proust dramatized this tendency in a particularly memorable scene in The Fugitive. The narrator misreads a garbled telegraph from Gilbert as being from the now deceased Albertine, projecting onto the message. So I just gave away the fact that Albertine dies if you haven't read the novel, but it's a really striking instance of misreading, Proust illustrating this tendency to project onto a text what we want to see. The narrator misreads a garbled telegraph from Gilbert as being from the now deceased Albertine, projecting onto the message his and the reader's hopes for a reunion. Upon discovering this mistake, the narrator offers yet another theory of reading, one that deflates the redemptive conception of reading just cited. So here we have two examples of Proust talking about reading which seem to be in tension with one another. He says, "We guess as we read, we create. Everything starts from an initial error. those that follow, and this applies to not only the reading of letters and telegrams, not only to all reading, extraordinary as they may appear to a person who has not begun at the same place, are all quite natural. A large part of what we believe to be true, and this applies even to our final conclusions, with an obstinacy equaled only by our good faith, springs from an original mistake in our premises. So all reading is a misreading because we've already selected out quite arbitrarily the premises from which our reading will take place. Taken together, these different ideas of reading suggest that reading oneself is necessarily bound up with misreading oneself, inasmuch as reading and introspection involve what our narrator thinks of as an unreliable faculty, that of memory. Large portions of à la recherche cast doubt on our ability to clarify text and self by means of a rational and deliberative process. This is why the theory of involuntary memory, for which the novel is so famous, is so important. Genuine insights occur only by means of dramatic and inadvertent breaks from the deadening influence of habit and the distorting influence of ordinary memory. For my part, I would argue that responsible forms of reading and self-reading attempt, as best as possible, to identify the presuppositions that inform these practices, and thus to control the role that preconceptions play in the selection, construction, and thus the avoidance and neglect of countervailing textual evidence. À la recherche may well be a singular reference for philosophers today, and it certainly is for those in the hermeneutic and working in the hermeneutic and deconstructive traditions, inasmuch as it helps to sensitize us to that which resists straightforward conceptual articulation, that which resists reading, resists being read. In this respect, my reading can be situated amongst some of the recent scholarly attempts to understand certain aspects of à la recherche in terms of Kant's philosophy, and in particular in terms of Kant's account of aesthetics. For the purposes of this essay, the aesthetic will be understood as the specifically sensuous mode of experience that Kant described as resistant to the demands of cognition and the claims of morality. And this will be very important for what I will be arguing in this text about what the work has to say about the nature of the aesthetic, that is to say, about the sensuous apprehension of the beautiful. That is to say, I'm interested in this separation of the aesthetic mode of evaluating things from a cognitive mode of evaluating things or a moral mode of evaluating things. Simply put, when Kant asks us to evaluate something aesthetically, he tells us to ask the question, is it pleasing? Is the mere form of its appearance pleasing? Not to ask, is it good or is it true? Not to ask a moral question about it or a practical question about it or a cognitive question about it, is it true? The question for aesthetics, and it's a limited question, is just, does the form of its appearance please? Is this the occasion for the experience of pleasure or not? Understanding the aesthetic in terms of its essential difference from the cognitive and moral aspects of human experience is not to say that reason and morality have nothing to do with art and literature. It is to accept the largely Kantian conception of the aesthetic, according to which the question, is it pleasing, cannot be settled by adducing everything that we might know about an object or by assessing its practical worth. Further, for the sake of this exercise, I will be presupposing what many readers take to be well established, namely that the narrator of à la recherche not only espouses a form of philosophical idealism, but the novel itself embodies a form of idealism, inasmuch as ideas such as love, jealousy, time, memory, and art are treated as at least as real, if not more real, than material things. For some time now, readers have felt that à la recherche has much to teach us about the connection between life and the construction of art. However, I want to shift things in order to explore what the work has to say about the experience of being a spectator. Because Proust's work is composed of dense descriptions in which the narrator's feelings of pleasure and displeasure are often remarked upon, there is a tendency to widen the scope of the aesthetic when discussing Proust. For my part, and I think that's problematic to say the entire work is written in the key of the aesthetic. For my part, I propose limiting matters by paying attention to the specific instances in which the narrator is himself engaged in the type of spectatorship that we associate with art or beauty. My wager is that the work has something essential to teach us about the nature of these experiences as they have come to be shaped by the age of aesthetics. It is not possible to explore every such instance of spectatorship staged in the novel. Instead, the discussion will be anchored by two passages where the shareability, communicability, and universality of aesthetic pleasure are at issue. And I will be treating those terms, shareability, communicability, and universality of aesthetic pleasure, of aesthetic judgment, as synonymous in this essay. One such passage occurs towards the end of The Fugitive in the famous section, Sojourn in Venice. Sojourn in Venice recounts the time that Marcel and his mother spent visiting churches, piazzas, and museums, including the famous sites like San Marco, the Doge's Palace, the Arsenal, and the Accademia. The pair even take a side trip to Padua in order to visit the chapel containing the Giotto frescoes that Swann had once shared with the young Marcel early in Swann's Way. In a chapter during which the narrator contemplates a number of beautiful images and objects, one passage in particular stands out. And this is the first of the two major passages that I will be citing. Although it is rather long, it is necessary to quote this passage at length